Fear is one of the most misunderstood forces in leadership. People say fear is toxic. They say fear destroys trust. They say good leaders should never be feared. But history tells a very different story. Some of the most stable leaders, institutions, and systems in human history were built on something simple: clear consequences. 5 centuries ago, Niccolò Machiavelli wrote a sentence that still shocks people today in The Prince. "It is safer to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both." For many, this sounds cruel. But Machiavelli was not celebrating fear. He was describing how power actually works. And the uncomfortable truth is this: fear, when structured correctly, can stabilize authority in ways affection never can. Modern culture encourages leaders to be approachable, friendly, and liked. We are told the best leaders inspire through kindness and empathy. And those qualities certainly matter. But leadership does not exist in a world without conflict. Difficult decisions must be made. Rules must be enforced. Boundaries must hold under pressure. And when those moments arrive, something interesting happens. People stop asking whether a leader is nice. They start asking whether a leader is serious. This is where fear quietly enters the system. Not as cruelty, not as oppression, but as a signal that certain lines cannot be crossed. In this episode, we explore why fear has such a negative reputation, why it continues to shape authority across history, and why the most effective leaders understand something most people ignore. Fear, when used correctly, is not chaos. It is structure. From childhood, we are taught that fear is always a negative force. Parents try to remove fear from discipline. Teachers are encouraged to avoid it in classrooms. Organizations promote cultures built entirely on comfort and positivity. The idea is simple. If people feel safe and supported, they will behave well on their own. But reality rarely works that way. Because human behavior is not guided by good intentions alone. It is guided by incentives. It is guided by consequences. And most importantly, it is guided by boundaries. Fear is often misunderstood because people associate it with brutality. They imagine tyrants, dictators, and cruel rulers who control through violence. But that is not the kind of fear Machiavelli was describing. The fear he understood was much quieter. It was the awareness that actions carry consequences. That authority is real. That rules are not simply suggestions. When people know there are no consequences, behavior changes quickly. Rules begin to bend. Standards begin to drop. Challenges become more frequent. But when people understand that certain lines cannot be crossed without repercussions, something interesting happens. Order stabilizes, not because people are terrified, but because they understand the structure of the system. Fear in this sense is not panic. It is clarity. Clarity about where authority begins and where it ends. And leaders who eliminate this clarity in the name of being liked often discover something uncomfortable. Without consequences, authority slowly dissolves. If fear has such a negative reputation, why has it remained such a powerful force throughout history? The answer lies in human psychology. People often claim they prefer leaders who are kind, approachable, and generous. But when it comes to behavior, something far more powerful shapes their decisions. Consequences. Human beings are highly sensitive to potential loss. Psychologists call this loss aversion, the tendency to avoid negative outcomes even more strongly than we pursue positive rewards. In simple terms, people will often work harder to avoid punishment than they will to gain approval. This is why systems built purely on goodwill tend to weaken over time. When the worst possible outcome is disappointment, people eventually begin to test the boundaries. Deadlines become flexible. Rules become negotiable. Authority becomes something that can be debated rather than respected. But when consequences are clear, behavior changes immediately. People become more attentive, more careful, more disciplined, not because they are constantly afraid, but because they understand the cost of crossing certain lines. This is the subtle power of fear. Fear creates anticipation. It makes people pause before making decisions. It forces individuals to consider the outcomes of their actions before acting impulsively. This is why Niccolò Machiavelli argued in The Prince that fear can be more reliable than affection. Affection depends on mood. Fear depends on understanding. When people understand that authority carries real consequences, they adjust their behavior accordingly. And in structured systems, governments, institutions, organizations, this understanding becomes the invisible mechanism that maintains order. Fear, when structured properly, does not create chaos. It prevents it, because it replaces uncertainty with clarity. People know exactly where the boundaries are. And when boundaries are clear, stability becomes possible. Few political ideas have been quoted as often and misunderstood as deeply as the famous line from The Prince. It is safer to be feared than loved if one cannot be both. For centuries, critics have used this sentence to portray Niccolò Machiavelli as an advocate of cruelty. But that interpretation misses the strategic point he was making. Machiavelli was not encouraging leaders to terrorize people. He was explaining something far more practical. Love is voluntary. Fear is predictable. When people love a leader, they remain loyal as long as that love continues to benefit them. The relationship is emotional, and emotions change quickly when circumstances become difficult. But fear, when tied to clear rules and consistent consequences, creates a stable framework for behavior. People may disagree with a leader. They may even dislike the leader. But if they understand that authority is real and enforceable, they will still operate within the system. This was the distinction Machiavelli wanted rulers to understand. The greatest danger to leadership is not criticism. It is instability. A leader who relies entirely on love risks losing control the moment affection disappears. A leader who establishes authority through structured consequences, however, creates a system that continues functioning even when emotions fluctuate. But Machiavelli added an important warning. Fear must never become hatred. Hatred is dangerous because it motivates people to actively destroy the authority that governs them. Fear, when balanced correctly, does something different. It creates caution, it encourages discipline, and it reminds people that leadership decisions carry weight. In other words, the fear Machiavelli described was not emotional panic. It was respect reinforced by consequence, a quiet understanding that certain lines should not be crossed. And when leaders maintain that understanding, their authority becomes far more durable than popularity alone. Every functioning system relies on one thing: boundaries. Rules that define what is acceptable and what is not. But rules alone are meaningless. Without consequences, rules slowly transform into suggestions. And when that happens, authority begins to weaken. This is where fear quietly performs its most important function. Fear protects boundaries, not through constant intimidation, but through the simple understanding that consequences exist. Think about any stable environment: a courtroom, a military unit, a well-run organization. In each case, people understand the limits of acceptable behavior, not because they are constantly threatened, but because the consequences of crossing those limits are clear and predictable. When boundaries are enforced consistently, people adapt quickly. They learn which actions carry risk. They learn which lines should not be crossed. And eventually, most individuals regulate their own behavior without the leader needing to intervene at all. This is the hidden efficiency of structured authority. Fear does not require constant presence. It works because the possibility of consequence already exists in people's minds. But when leaders avoid enforcing boundaries in the name of kindness, the opposite happens. Small violations go unchallenged. Standards quietly slip. People begin to test the system. At first, the challenges are subtle. A delayed task, a rule ignored, a decision quietly questioned. But over time, those small tests grow larger. Because people are constantly evaluating authority. They are asking themselves one silent question. Is this leader willing to enforce the rules? If the answer becomes uncertain, the entire system begins to drift. This is why Niccolò Machiavelli emphasized the importance of maintaining authority in the prince. Not to create oppression, but to preserve stability. Fear, when tied to clear boundaries, does something simple but powerful. It removes ambiguity. People know where the limits are. And when limits are understood, order becomes much easier to maintain. Fear can stabilize authority. Hatred destroys it. And understanding the difference between the two was one of the most important warnings Niccolò Machiavelli gave in The Prince. Because fear and hatred are not the same emotion. Fear produces caution. Hatred produces rebellion. When people fear consequences, they adjust their behavior. They become more disciplined, more attentive to rules, and more careful about crossing boundaries. But when people hate a leader, something very different happens. They begin looking for ways to remove that leader. Hatred creates motivation. It pushes people to conspire, resist, and eventually revolt against the system itself. This is why Machiavelli warned rulers about something very specific. A leader should aim to be feared without ever becoming hated. And the difference between the two often comes down to fairness. People can accept strict rules if those rules are applied consistently. They can tolerate discipline if it is predictable. They can even respect tough leadership if they believe the system is stable and not personally abusive. But hatred grows when authority becomes arbitrary, when punishments feel personal, when leaders appear to act out of anger, ego, or cruelty. At that point, fear stops functioning as a stabilizing force. It transforms into resentment, and resentment quietly builds beneath the surface until the system eventually cracks. The most effective leaders understand this balance instinctively. They enforce rules firmly. They maintain consequences, but they avoid unnecessary cruelty. Because cruelty does not strengthen authority. It weakens it. Fear should make people cautious. Hatred makes people dangerous. And once hatred spreads through a system, restoring stability becomes far more difficult than maintaining it in the first place. Many people assume the ideas of Niccolò Machiavelli belong to a distant past, an era of kings, courts, and political intrigue. But the principles described in The Prince never disappeared. They simply evolved. Today, fear rarely appears in dramatic forms like public punishments or visible displays of power. Instead, it operates quietly through reputation and consequence. Consider how authority works in modern institutions. In organizations, employees understand that certain behaviors can lead to termination. In governments, laws exist with penalties for violation. In competitive industries, reputations can be destroyed by reckless decisions. These systems function not because people are constantly being punished, but because the possibility of consequence exists. That possibility creates discipline. People think carefully before breaking rules. They weigh risks before challenging authority. They consider outcomes before acting impulsively. This is the modern form of strategic fear. It does not rely on intimidation. It relies on clarity. Leaders who understand this principle do not constantly threaten others. They simply maintain systems where consequences are predictable and unavoidable when boundaries are crossed. Once that structure becomes visible, something powerful happens. People regulate themselves. They adjust their behavior without constant supervision. And the system begins to run smoothly, not because everyone loves the leader, but because everyone understands the framework of authority. This is the deeper insight behind Machiavelli's observation. Fear, when used recklessly, creates chaos. But fear, when tied to fairness and structure, creates stability. It reminds people that leadership is not merely symbolic. It carries real weight. And when that weight is understood, authority becomes durable enough to survive disagreement, criticism, and change. Fear is often portrayed as the enemy of good leadership. But history suggests something more complex. Fear, when controlled and balanced, can be one of the most effective tools for maintaining order. It clarifies boundaries. It reinforces consequences. And it reminds people that authority is not just a position, it is a responsibility backed by structure. This was the lesson Niccolò Machiavelli was trying to communicate in The Prince. Not that leaders should rule through cruelty, but that leadership without enforceable authority is fragile. In the next episode, we explore another uncomfortable truth about power. The price every leader must eventually pay for authority. Because influence always comes with a cost. And the higher someone rises, the heavier that cost becomes.